Thank you all for being here for Spirit of Truth. I'm Ray Parrish, and I just wanted to talk about um, the things that we ignore in the public school system, which I'm a part of the public school system. What do we ignore, and why do we ignore it? Why do we ignore these essential items? Okay, the first item that we often ignore in the public school system would be, of course, eternity and afterlife. And first of all, I just think a lot of that is this world is so big and gigantic that we just don't want to talk about the idea of death. That is just avoided. And in most of history, of course, that was explored a lot, big time. Because that is the one thing. Remember, Ben Franklin said the only two things in life that are certain are death and taxes. Love to just quickly to try to understand Martin Luther King when he says, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. In his I Have a Dream speech/sermon, he was actually getting that from a hymn. It dates back to the 1890s, but a lot of people think it goes earlier. It is what slaves used to sing in, believe it or not, the graveyard. That actual freedom and eternity happened in the graveyard. Also, the Puritans, who I love to talk about, and this is uncomfortable when I teach my kids this, but the Puritans would often take their kids to a graveyard. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's sad. They would say, here is the graveyard. This is for your brother who died, your grandmother, or even, of course, your mother who died giving birth to you. And so that would be really weird for the modern education system to do that. However, of course, for one thing, that is death is going to happen. But at the other thing, they're not saying, well, this is not the Roman idea, just eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow you die, so just have a lot of fun. They are very focused on eternity and the afterlife. And that is a big part of the public education system was born by the Puritans. And so they would ask for no apologies for teaching about eternity and the afterlife. They did amazing with that in science, like Harvard in 1636. God was the centerpiece of their education, God and eternity. And now the centerpiece of education is what? Grades, getting it into a college, learning how to not stress over things, learning how to write essays. These are all things that need to happen. But to look at the big idea and to try to understand the origins of public education come from this idea of God. Be more specific, Jesus is the centerpiece. So this idea of eternity and afterlife needs to be focused on, at least somewhat, in the public school system. The second idea are three of my favorite words, and this is a pop quiz. The first three words of the U.S. Constitution, we the people. And that is always trying to understand who exactly are the people. But the thing that is ignored so often, of course, is that made in the image of God. And this is something that needs to be explored and to understand God's image. Just say the Quakers, who, by the way, the Puritans really couldn't stand a whole lot, but the Quakers believe there's this inner light within them. The Puritans, and there's truth in that, this inner light of God, but the Puritans were much more focused on this idea of off the mark. And you may know that off the mark is sin. And a great thing for our public school is, well, what is our mark exactly? And sin just means off the mark. And in this case, a lot of times, me teaching and others, we are just off the mark in what we teach. And so the Puritans were very much about trying to understand. They were not surprised by anything that would happen. They understood that the problems of people and their sinful nature, while at the same time made in God's image. And so trying to understand that and sort of wrestle with that, mankind and his sin made in the image of God, a gigantic question in human history that, at least at the highest level, gets ignored in our public school system. And so I would like myself, I'm speaking to myself, is to really focus on that quite a bit over and over again. The third item would be prayer. Being able to talk directly to our Creator. That is absolutely amazing. And I know a lot of people have said, hey, as long as there's crazy calculus teachers, we're going to have prayer in the schools. But ever since the 1960s, that idea has been pushed aside. And the idea of prayer and God and his team, I try to call them that, they are above our public school and saying, we are here for you if you want us. If not, just try to do it yourself. And so the idea of having prayer groups, of having what was once again used to be a centerpiece of the universities and the public school system, if the power who created us is willing to talk directly to us and to guide us in our journey, in our path in life, and we ignore that, it's once again, it's a very much just off the mark. This idea that our public school system, in that realm, we put them on other marks and we take them away from the gigantic mark of talking directly to God and to Jesus. Item number 4, miracles. And I have a great book on American miracles and how they are just ignored. And we live in a very scientific world. A lot of scientists do not want to hear about miracles. Lee Strobel, the former atheist who's now a wonderful believer, his book, The Case for Miracles, is absolutely incredible. It almost should be a class in high school called Miracles. These are things that we just can't explain. And so I'll just say there's another book I have called The Miracle at Philadelphia. And I'd love to talk about the Constitutional Convention because of what happened there when a bunch of scattered guys get together and create the world's oldest constitution. The miracles of the American Civil War and the fact that it ended at Easter. A lot of times that's not talked about, but the miracles that happened during that war, and that Lee surrenders on Palm Sunday. Of course, Lincoln was seen as a Jesus figure when he is shot on Good Friday in sacrificing for others. And so there's plenty of others. There are so many miracles. One, just real quick, George Washington was a guy who had bullets just bounce off of him. I know that sounds weird, but in the French and Indian War during a battle, one of his uniforms, people saw this. You could count 5 places, actually 4 on his uniform and 1 in his hat, where a bullet had hit him. Now, of course, we understand, well, the bullet must have been far away. But there are so many other stories of the miracles of George Washington, of how he should have died and he didn't. And I'll just say this, I don't think George Washington is talked about. We talked about much in our current culture. We do, it's George Washington Day and we'll see him on a commercial. But to understand why Washington is being criticized a bit now because of owning slaves, I want to get to that later. But what America would have been without George Washington, and in many ways, an incredible miracle for America. 5th, and last and not least, Jesus, and how Jesus is ignored in the public school system in many ways. I mean, he is, I think most people would say, gosh, he's the most famous person in human history. A lot of people reject that, but folks who are honest realize this guy is so famous on this planet throughout history, and yet, of course, he never was wealthy. He never himself was a governor or king of anything down here. He never took over the Roman Empire. He never wrote anything down himself. He was not wealthy. Most people throughout human history who are famous, they have power on this planet, they are wealthy, they lead an army, They are a Caesar or a czar, and they control everyone around them. So why is Jesus so incredibly famous? I'd like to read a quote from Napoleon. As Napoleon is about to leave this world, he had this to say about Jesus. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I myself have founded great empires. But upon what do these creations of our genius depend? Upon force. Jesus alone founded his empire upon love, and to this very day millions would die for him. I think I understand something of human nature, and I tell you, all these were men, and I'm a man. No one else is like him. Jesus Christ was more than a man. Jesus has the biggest legacy of anyone. Christianity is the #1 religion still on this planet. And if I could get back to Ben Franklin just a bit, Ben Franklin said the only things in life that are certain are death and taxes. And one thing I do with that is I put life, liberty, and property with death, sin, and taxes. Because death and sin, which of course comes from the Bible, comes especially from Romans, he's basically saying, Benjamin Franklin is, well, you need taxes because you need government because people are sinful and need control. So if we could blend death, sin, and taxes, and life, liberty, and property to see the battle going on there. And of course, these are gigantic things. Once again, our school doesn't really talk about death. We don't want to talk about sin. That's just not something we really even mention. But they are the two gigantic problems human beings have not been able to solve. And so what I try to tell my students is when you think about death and sin, then what you have to think about sin and death. Let me put it in that order. Because then what you have to go to is the crucifixion and the resurrection. Those are two gigantic stories that are, once again, they're kind of a sidebar looking at the history of the world. But the idea of the crucifixion to pay for sin, and the idea of death is not the ultimate, that there is a thing called resurrection. And so that in our public school system, to try to focus on, guys, I'm sorry, me included, we're sinful people. We just are not perfect. We're off the mark. What sin means, we all are. And then we're all going to expire, I try to tell them. So that's a gigantic, two gigantic problems. And the humans haven't been able to solve. And that's why Jesus coming back into the public school system, it's absolutely a gigantic must. This is incredible truth, which is the motto of our class, of course. This is a gigantic truth that needs to be explored, at least given a chance, is what I would say. Just give it a chance. So these are my thoughts on the public education, the school system that I adore. I want to make sure that's understood. And I would love for us to explore these and just give each of these at least a chance for kids to just get a glimpse of some of the most important questions that the Puritans were very much, we have got to explore these questions. And I just don't think that we do. And I would love to explore these more and more in the public school system myself and the kids that I teach. But thank you so much for watching. We truly appreciate you being here in the spirit of truth.